Hello and thank you for clicking on this video. Now you may remember when I made my modern starching technique video, I also promised that I would do the traditional technique, and here it is! So, welcome! Now if you're like me, you're probably thinking that starching is the most annoying, boring, difficult process. You can never get it like the factories, and it's very messy and time consuming. And you'd be right, for the most part. But once you perfect the techniques that I'm going to show you in this video, you will be able to make flawless collars that look exactly like the originals. This is an original. These are the same colour, by the way, but this is an original that has its original starch. This is one that I restarched, and you can barely tell the difference. So you'll be able to achieve collars just as beautiful and pristine as this, and you won't need to use those washable collars anymore, because you'll have the authentic look and feel, and it won't take you much time at all, and your collars will probably last longer than the washable ones. Now I thought my original technique was pretty good and I could just show that on YouTube, but when I started comparing the collars I'd starched to the antiques, I realised that actually my starching wasn't all that good, and so I spent many hours researching manuals, magazines, housewives books, servants books, old videos, until I finally figured out 4 ways to starch your collar domestically in your own house. Now of course people would have sent their collars to industrial laundrettes to have them all done for them, but there are also people who did it at home, did it for themselves, did it for their husbands, and there were also servants who worked in big estates or even just small middle class houses that would have done that too. So there are a few manuals on it. So the 4 methods that we're going to cover in today's video don't have anything to do with the pressing and ironing, it's all to do with the starch mixture. The pressing and ironing we'll get into, that's a very important part of the process. But the 4 methods I'm about to mention are just for the starch mixture, because I'm aware that I have viewers from all over the world and not everything is available in every country, right? So there are 4 methods and they are as follows: the grating method, the lathering method, the chemist's method, and the wax method. And all of these produce a slightly different effect, but they all work very well, so no matter what chemicals you have available to you, you should be able to make beautifully starched collars yourself. Now whilst you're watching the video, you may notice I have made quite a small batch of starch, and it fits inside a saucepan or a cooking pot. And the reason for that is that if you're a one-man operation like me, you're not going to have enough time to do 10 collars into the starch and then iron them all out. I mean, it takes a little bit too long. You won't be able to do huge batches unless there are many people starching the collars with you. So about 3 or 4 is probably the max I can do in one night. And it only takes me about 30 minutes to actually iron and polish all of them, and the starching process really takes just about less than 10 minutes. So you can get these pumped out really quickly. But only 4 at a time. Now there are lots of articles, there are lots of forum posts online about this, and I was never quite satisfied with their techniques or what they were doing. It never quite looked like the original, but trust me, hopefully this will be the definitive way to starch your collars. So if you're really interested in getting the authentic look and you're not a fan of washables, or you're just going to an event and you want to get that perfect crisp collar, stay tuned. After the intro, we'll be going straight into it. First, a heads up. Take note of the fabric of your collar. If you've just cut the collar off of your favourite shirt with the hopes of starching it, you may be disappointed. Contrary to what you might believe, starting with a thick, heavy weave of fabric is actually counterproductive, as the fabric needs to be light and absorbent so that the starch can seep in and soak the fabric entirely. Antique collars will be made of linen. They'll be sewn in 3 plies, with an inside layer of linen for absorbing extra starch and making the collar stiffer. Modern collars will likely be made out of cotton or cotton blend and will have fusing inside that will prevent it from actually absorbing any starch, much like the Darcy washable collars. Yes, that's right, Darcy washable collars cannot be starched in this way. If you are interested in starching modern collars, however, I'd like to refer you to my previous video on the modern way to starch collars. Now, onto the process. So, things you'll need: a cooking pot, a jug for some water, starch, rice, corn, potato, your choice, collars to starch, and then any of the ingredients of the method that you want to follow: a coat hanger or bar, grease-proof paper, an iron and an ironing board. and optionally a round metal pot for shaping. Wait, but don't grab that yet. No, watch the video first and then do it. Sit back down. Cleaning the collars. Historically, collars were washed in giant industrial washing machines with soft soaps to remove the starch, which in turn removed the sweat that had built up and yellowed the collars. The videos and advertisements don't go into much detail about the type of soap, but it was common to use a type of whitener called blue for a process that was called bluing. This stopped the fabrics turning yellow. In regards to removing old starch from collars, an extract from a 1934 edition of the Australian Woman's Mirror suggests placing collars in warm water with a tablespoon of extract of malt and leaving it overnight to draw out the starch. However, if, like me, you don't have extract of malt, then I recommend first damping your collars with cold water to make the starch run. Then you can put them into boiling water. Slapping them straight into boiling water can cause clumps of starch to form under the layers, so yeah, make sure you kind of rinse them first. You'll want to boil your collars in a saucepan, being sure to stir them, agitate them, and also rinse them from time to time to get rid of the old starch. Depending on how much starch was in your collar in the first place, this could be the longest and most annoying process of them all. After this, give them a last wash in your washing machine. Now, historically, industrial machines were used, so using a washing machine during this process is fine and pretty accurate. Making the starch solution. Historically, each laundrette and company would have used their own type of starch and their own mixture. But don't fret, you can use any kind of starch. Potato starch, rice starch, cornstarch, or branded laundry starch as long as it's a powder and not a liquid. I recommend Kershaw's laundry starch, which I used in the UK, as it has a natural whitening agent in it. But now that I'm in Japan, I use regular cornstarch. Today I will show you 3 different methods of making collar starch and talk about a 4th. I was incredibly concerned with getting that beautiful shine you see on antique collars, and I'm happy to say that all 3 resulted in nice shines. Which one you choose will be up to you, or the items that are available in your region. The basic solution, however, consists of 250 grams of powdered starch and 650 milliliters of water, and each method adds its own extra ingredients. For ease of explanation, I've given them these nicknames: the Grating Method, the Lathering Method, the Chemist's Method, and the Wax Method. The Grating Method is the most simple, so we'll start with that. First of all, measure about 250 grams of starch. I know in this video I only put 200 grams of starch in, but I later added 50 grams extra. So add the 250 grams of starch to the saucepan. After that, you want to add 250 milliliters of cold water and mix it into a slurry. This is to dissolve the starch so that when you add the hot water it doesn't turn into clumps. Once you've mixed it into a slurry, add around 400 milliliters of hot water, making sure not to boil the starch. Don't boil it. Stir that around until there are no clumps and the starch has a milk-like consistency. And this essentially makes up the basic solution for starching collars. Now, starch alone won't give you a good shine, so if you want the classic shine like I've achieved on this collar, then you'll have to use a bar of soap. I use this brand. The easiest method is to grate the soap into the mix and stir until the soap pieces have dissolved. I don't know what the science behind this is, but it was a tip in a household manual that belongs to a friend of mine, that he won't let me use a photograph of. If you're going for the lathering method, however, don't add the soap just yet, and we'll get to that later. Next up, let's take a look at what I've nicknamed the Chemist's Method. You'll need your pot and measuring jug again, a tablespoon and a teaspoon, the exact same starch as the previous method, and the special ingredients borax, that's sodium borate, commonly used for making slime, and turpentine. Now the manual just said turpentine. All I have is spirit of turpentine, a solution used by painters, but it actually worked quite well. Like before, we take 250 grams of cornstarch and add it to the pot. Then we take 250 milliliters of cold water and mix the starch into a slurry. Then, take boiled water, it has to be boiling to dissolve the borax. You'll need 400 milliliters of water. Then add 1 teaspoon of borax and mix it in. Wait for the water to cool down a bit, but whilst it's still hot, add it to the mixture and stir thoroughly. After this, add a few drops of spirit of turpentine. Now, turpentine is toxic to the human body if inhaled or swallowed. I had my extraction fan on whilst doing this, but the fumes were still quite nasty. Instead of turpentine, the recipe also said that glycerin was a good alternative, and glycerin is safe. and borax has also been banned in the UK and the US due to causing severe skin irritation and burns for some people. Borax has long been used as a laundry detergent and as it's non-carcinogenic and cannot be absorbed through the skin, and it also doesn't accumulate in the body. That being said, some people have had severe skin irritations and burns because of it, so I certainly don't recommend you try it at home unless you know the chemicals you're working with. And don't be silly like me, wear gloves. I'm not sure if the chemicals will still be harmful when ironed into a collar, but I don't intend to starch my collars this way going forward, and I strongly suggest the safer soap methods, grating and lathering, which we'll get to shortly. Now let's talk about the fourth method, the wax method. This one consists of adding white beeswax into the starch mix. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any white beeswax in my area, so I was unable to try this for myself. However, collars from France are famous for being starched with beeswax, and I can show you some antique examples from my collection here. I'd love to know how this method turns out if anybody can try it. Just use the same steps in this video, but instead of soap or borax or turpentine, add some beeswax. Anyway, whichever starch solution you use from here on out, it's all the same, so let's look at the starching process. Historically, laundry companies would have used large industrial spinning machines to starch their collars in large quantities. If you have a cement mixer handy, by all means give it a go, but my way is much more analog. Once the mixture has been prepped, take a couple of collars, 2, 3, 4, and put them into the solution until they're saturated. Honestly, a few seconds is all you need, but you could go for 5 minutes to be safe. You know, the fabric can only absorb so much, so an hour or so is kinda overkill and can lead to the starch clumping up. Make sure you're constantly stirring the collars in the pot. Don't let them sit, because the starch will stick to the bottom of the pot, like this. Another wonderful tip that I learned in a household manual and saw being done on some videos is that when you take the collars out of the starch solution, you should massage them, squeeze out all the air bubbles, and make sure that each ply of fabric is laminated with that starch. You can do this 2 or 3 times to your collars whilst you're starching them. Lay out some cling film, put the collar on top, massage it, squeeze out the air bubbles, put it back in the pot, then after a little while, repeat the process. This will stop any starch residue accumulating on the top of the collar, as well as stop any clumps forming inside the collar. Drying the collars. Historically, the collars would have been flattened out, piled up, and then ironed with big heavy pressurized rollers. But our small domestic iron isn't going to be able to deal with that much starch, so we have to get rid of the excess somehow. The same videos and articles I mentioned earlier suggested leaving the collars up to hang and dry, and that's fine if it works for them. For me, it led to the starch all gathering at the bottom of the collars, like on this turn down collar, and it made pressing difficult, so I prefer spinning them. I have a washing machine, but I don't have a tumble dryer, and I don't recommend using one either because you don't want to heat them up. Instead, put them in the washing machine and do a dry spin for 5 to 8 minutes, depending on how many collars you've got, to get rid of the excess starch without wringing. Ironing. Historically, big industrial-sized irons would have been used. They could press multiple collars at the same time. The collars would then be flipped over and pressed again. This allowed industrial quantities of collars to be ironed all at the same time, and for each one to get just as even a press as the next. They didn't have wrinkles because a huge iron also acted as a press, squeezing them super flat. But I don't have one of those either. So instead we'll be sticking to the old iron and board method. First of all, turn off the steam setting on your iron. No steam at the start. Now you want to tear off 2 large pieces of grease-proof paper. Place the grease-proof paper over the ironing board, then place the collar down. After that, place another sheet on top of the collar to protect your iron. For this, you'll want your iron on a medium setting. Carefully iron the collar. I recommend ironing from the end of the leaves inwards, as sometimes there can be extra fabric that you don't want to crinkle. This doesn't have to be perfect though, because once the collar's dried out a bit, you're going to take off the top layer of grease-proof paper and iron again. This time, be sure to get rid of as many creases as possible, adding water where necessary to stop the iron sticking. You can also use steam at this point, but it runs the risk of delaminating the plies of linen that have been starched tightly together, and then you'll get warping. If the iron sticks, it will burn the starch, your collar will turn brown, and you'll have to start the process from the beginning. Press really hard with the iron, just like the machines did back then, and the creases will disappear like magic, leaving you with a rigid and hard collar. However, avoid ironing the seam where the collar turns down. We need that to remain dampish. The rest of the collar, however, you want to iron until it's bone dry. Polishing. Historically, after the collars had been ironed, they would be rolled through another press that would crimp them slightly, ready for shaping. We can skip that step because it doesn't help us. But the collars, nearly dry, would then be passed through a polishing machine that was a big hot steel roller that put pressure on the collars and led to a lovely shine. However, we'll be using the same old iron. Once the collar's neckband and leaf is dry, turn your iron up to high and start shining the collar, pressing hard, going back and forth. If you use the Grating, Chemist or Wax method, you'll see a great shine beginning to appear. If you didn't add anything to the starch and you were waiting for the Lathering method, well, here it is. Take a bar of soap and a bowl of water. Damp the soap and then rub it against the collar. Lather on a lot of soap. Then iron it over with the hot iron. This will create a really nice shine. Shaping. Historically, the collars would then be put through different machines depending on what type of style they were, and this is where the process changes for each collar. Winged collars historically would have used this type of machine. Can't exactly tell what it's doing, but it looks like it's a lever that uses pressure to move a mechanism that folds down the wings. The collars are then passed through this machine that gives them the curved shape. I recommend just placing your collar on the ironing board and simply folding the wings down yourself with your hand, and then gently pressing them. Historically, turn-down collars would be passed through a machine that turns the collar down, presses it, and then shapes it round. In the video we can't see exactly what's happening, but I imagine it's similar to this old hand-operated device still used by Barker's Laundry. Did you guess that that's another thing I don't have at home? And you can't turn the collar down flat, or it will just wrinkle and crease. But because we left the fold line damp, we can take our polished collar and wrap it around a metal pot, folding over the edge and pulling it down so that it takes shape. After this, you can go over it with an iron so that it stays curled. To secure the collar to the pot, I like to take a ribbon and pass it through both of the front buttonholes, and then tie it to the handle to secure it. I then glide the iron over the collar so that it keeps its curled shape. Historically, all of these collars would have been curled by machinery and then sorted by workers, but our curls won't be quite as dramatic, and so to keep the collars together we'll simply push a collar stud through and leave them to sit. Then, they'll retain their shape. The most important thing in this whole process is that you press really hard with the iron and you laminate all 3 plies of the collar fabric together. This will lead to the neckband on the inside and the collar leaf on the outside being really crisp and smooth, which is exactly what you want. This is the thing I see people struggling with the most, and when I look at the pictures of people who have starched their collars, they tend to have wrinkles on the neckband, but if you follow my method, you can get a smooth collar too. Another thing I'm so happy with is how the shine came out on the collars. Now this is something that people also struggle with, and so far I haven't really seen anybody else manage to get the classic shine that those collars used to have. Now of all the methods, I think I prefer the grating method because it makes it a lot easier and it will shine very quickly without having to do many passes. The only drawback is it makes the collar slightly softer. The lathering method makes the collar slightly harder because you're adding an extra layer of soap on the inside and outside. Now it does have a slight waxy texture, but it won't rub off onto your ties or anything. The only problem with that method is it's a little bit hit and miss and you can get a blotchy surface, so you have to make sure you really wet the soap bar and you get a very even spread. And it's also quite time consuming to do that afterwards. So why don't you try both methods and see which one works for you? Let me know in the comments down below which one you prefer. Of course, the Chemist method also gave a really nice result. They weren't quite as shiny as the collars where I used soap, but they do shine and they do look very nice and presentable. The good thing about this method is that the collars actually get much stiffer and they're not quite as soft as the ones where I used soap. And also the iron doesn't stick to the starch as much because of the borax and turpentine. Okay guys, so you can see whichever method you use, you're going to get a very crisp, pressed collar that has no wrinkles, no warping, and it's very shiny. Now I must admit, the one that looks the most accurate to the historical collars is the Chemist's method, but I know that lots of those chemicals are banned in different countries for different reasons, and so I really recommend the soap method. It's the cheapest option, it's the easiest option, and it's the safest, let's be honest. Now I promise you, this does take a little bit of practice. You have to kind of get to know the starch solution, you have to get to know your iron and the collars, and probably the first few attempts will come out terrible. But don't worry, if you do burn your collar, you can always just wash it and that burnt starch will come straight out. Remember that clothes are just clothes. We wear clothes, they wrinkle, they get ruined, and we're human. There's room for human error, so you don't have to make your collars super perfect all of the time. I even have historical antique ones that have obviously been put through machinery, and they still have little wrinkles and little bits of warping here and there. But the more you practice, the better you'll get. When I first started doing this, as you saw in the video, yeah, they weren't coming out perfectly. They're a little bit wrinkled. But now I can get them really crisp and beautiful, so practice makes perfect. Well, I'd be really interested to know which methods you guys love, so let me know down in the comments your favourite method, what worked for you, what do you find difficult, and I'll see if I can help you out. Maybe somebody else in the comments might try and help you out. And remember that you can also find me on Instagram, so be sure to send me a message there showing me a picture of the collars that you've starched. I'd love to see what you guys come up with. So I really hope this will be the definitive guide on how to starch collars, and I hope it's helped some people out there. And if you just watched this because you were interested in, the history of it or how it would be done, then thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, all the things that YouTubers normally say that I probably forget to say. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee, you can subscribe, hit the little bell thing. I don't know, is there something else I'm supposed to say? Follow me on Instagram. End of video, done!